Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the Preventing Genocide panel of this conference. I have one announcement from the conference directorate, which is those of you who've purchased lunches ought to go to the hallway, not outside, as announced earlier, and just follow the instructions on your ticket. So, to the hallway. I've also been told that we'll run until about 11:15 because we've run over on the first session. So this session will go to 11:15. I'm delighted that we have assembled this particular panel, wide-ranging in experience and great depth in knowledge. And you'll see that. I'll introduce each panel member right now, and then we'll proceed my left to right with Dr. Abosch-Jacobson first. Maybe could you shut that back door? Okay. Dr. Sara Abosch-Jacobson is the Barbara Rabin Education Officer for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It was my pleasure to meet her last year during a talk that was given at the museum, and we've been talking about potentially having Brigham Young University students involved there. I was deeply impressed as I went through the museum myself and saw the way the museum was curated, the situation of genocide, how it was handled, and of course, particularly the destruction of European Jews, the attempted destruction of European Jews by Hitler's Third Reich. I teach the Holocaust here at Brigham Young University, and so that's of particular importance to me. She's an experienced educator, has researched, taught, and written on Jewish culture and history, holds a PhD in modern European and Jewish history, an MA in modern British and Jewish history, and an MA in political science with a concentration in civil-military relations. At the museum, she is responsible for all content-related matters. She regularly speaks on the Holocaust, topics in Jewish history and culture, and the history covered in the museum's core and special exhibitions. Dr. Sam Rush Rushworth is a consultant with the Aegis Trust in helping to forge new strategic partnerships and develop innovative peace education programs in the Central African Republic, Kenya, and elsewhere in the region. He has a BA in economics and a postgraduate diploma in conflict and reconstruction from the University of Manchester, and a master's degree in PhD in education and international development from the University of East Anglia. His research describes the experience of reconciliation in Rwanda from the perspective of young people growing up at a secondary boarding school in Kigali, where he was their class teacher from 2012 to 2015. Dr. Rushworth has served in senior levels in the British Red Cross and is currently the co-director of the UK's all-party parliamentary group for the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. And this is where I became connected with Dr. Rushworth and work there. He is currently chair of Bishop Auckland Constituency Labour Party and running to be the Labour Party candidate for Bishop Auckland. Yes, please do come right in. We've got seats here in the front as well. Don't be shy. Thank you so much for attending. Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett serves as president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, established in 2008 to continue the legacy of her father, the late great Congressman Tom Lantos, who was the only Holocaust survivor serving in Congress. Dr. Lantos Swett is the former chair and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, USIRF, and teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University in Boston. She currently serves as co-chair of the board of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea and the Budapest-based Thomas Lantos Institute. Dr. Lantos Swett also serves on the advisory board of the UN Watch, the annual Anne Frank Award and Lecture, and the Warren B. Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Policy. She earned a political science degree from Yale University, a Juris Doctorate from the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and a PhD in history from the University of Southern Denmark. She just served as a judge at the 2022 Women's Empowerment and Religious Freedom Film Competition, sponsored by Empower Women Media. These wonderful short films tell powerful stories of inclusivity and cross-faith collaboration. Dr. Abosch-Jacobson, please. Yes, could you?
Thank you for inviting me to join you in this this really, I think, significant and important undertaking. And thank you for giving me 10 minutes in which to do this. I feel like the Rabbi Hillel being asked, what is Torah? And being told, love thy neighbor as thyself. All the rest is commentary. So now I can sit down. So Paul had asked me to talk really a bit about the museum that I work for and how we approach the topic of genocide education. So I work for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I wanted to start by saying, because this is about religion and genocide, that we are not a religious institution. The Jewish community in Dallas thinks we're Jewish. The Gentile community in Dallas thinks we're not. We're neither fish nor fowl. We take a kind of neutral educational line. Our DNA is Jewish. We were founded in 1978 in the living room of a group of local area Holocaust survivors who settled in Dallas, and we first opened our doors in 1984. And our initial name is interesting. We were the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies. So our approach was two-pronged. It was to memorialize the families that had been left behind in Europe who had no burial place for the founding survivors, but it was also to educate about the Holocaust and what had happened. It wasn't to educate about the lessons of the Holocaust, which is the terminology that's used now, because I don't think that any of the survivors thought at that juncture, and still so close to what they had experienced, that there were lessons to be learned. They just wanted to make sure that people knew about this so this didn't happen again. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and the decision was made to move that original facility out of the bosom of the Jewish community. It had been in the Dallas Jewish Community Center, and to move downtown to the west end of Dallas and to reopen there. And as we reopened, we renamed ourselves. We became the Dallas Holocaust Museum / Center for Education and Tolerance. So the mission was very clearly broadened at that point, and the name was broadened. That was a temporary location that became a transitional location because we were there from 2005 until 2019, when we walked across the street from where we were to a new 55,000 square foot facility and changed our name to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I take you through all of this not to kind of give you the boring history of it, but to indicate that there were changes that were involved as the museum kind of morphed from being strictly a Holocaust and Memorial Center into a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And we don't pay lip service to the human rights part of this, which has been kind of the accusation that has been leveled at some Holocaust museums where they kind of add a room as an afterthought. 50% of our facility deals with the Shoah and the Holocaust, and the other 50% deals with the issues of human rights. And I'll take you through very, very quickly the two-minute tour. So this isn't even the nickel tour. When you walk into the museum, you start at a wall that says, "Please enter here," and there is a bright red paint color, and you're given the definition of an upstander. An upstander is somebody who stands up for themselves or others, sees things wrong, and works to make them right. Basically, works to improve the world in which we lived. And then you enter the Orientation Theater, which is a 3-story experience as you climb up to the Shoah gallery or wing and the third floor core exhibit. And in that experience, you hear about who were the Jews, you hear about where did the Jews come from, you hear the history of anti-Semitism and how all of this is something that you should care about. And when I say you, I mean the general population, because we are localized to where we are in Central Texas. And most of the people who walk through our doors, 98% or so, are not Jewish and have no idea what a Jew is other than some kind of vague biblical understanding. And you come out at the top. Oh, by the way, that film takes about 5 minutes. So again, it's very Hillelian in terms of the approach and the information that it gives you. And you walk into the Shoah wing, which uses the paradigm of genocide being the Holocaust or the Shoah. It provides 17 different testimony stations, and everything is laid out geographically because we tend to think of the war as a chronological in a row, but it's not. And it takes you from Germany proper all the way to North Africa and back, across to deep into Eastern Europe, into the United States. I mean, it gives you this full geographical spread. And in each area, there are local Holocaust survivors' testimonies dealing with the events that they lived through. So, for example, in the 1938 section, which is in the Germany section, there are multiple testimonies from people who settled in Dallas who were children who lived through Kristallnacht, and Kristallnacht happens in 1938. So that's how it's done. You get to the end of the Shoah section, and you move into the human rights wing. The Human Rights Wing has three components. It has the International Military Tribunals, it has the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it has the 10 Stages of Genocide Gallery. The reason that it goes in that line, Shoah first and then into those, is because we want visitors to understand that the whole notion of an international human rights regime really is an outgrowth of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. It is in the wake of that event that you have the first notions of representational justice. You have the international military tribunals. You then see the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an aspirational and educational document. And we have a whole gallery where we have students sit down and discuss the UDHR, where it comes from, who was involved in it, why it's important, not just for us as Americans, but for the world to know that this thought is out there and that there are things to which they can aspire no matter how bad conditions are in some of the places in which they live. And then you move through that into, again, 48 and the Genocide Convention. And in the 10 Stages of Genocide, we present 10 historical genocides. And each one of those historical genocides is illustrated by a particular each one of the stages of genocide. There are 10 stages as per Dr. Gregory Stanton's educational and awareness and also predictive model. But what we do is we illustrate each one of these 10 stages with a different genocidal event. So we cover the Guatemalan genocide, Cambodia, Bosnia, Srebrenica in particular, and the Bosniak genocide, genocidal terror, which is radical religious terror, the Chinese Great Leap Forward, the Rwandan genocide, the Ukrainian Holodomor, the Texas genocide. That stage is persecution, and we deal with the persecution and ultimately eradication of the Karankawa, because we said to ourselves, we can't turn the lens on the rest of the world if we're not willing to look at ourselves in Texas, and we are Texas-based. The Tasmanian genocide, which is a complete extermination, and we end with the Armenian genocide, which is the stage of denial. From there, we pivot to America. That's our third wing. And in the pivot to America, we cover American ideals, reality, and repair. So the ideals on which we're founded, the reality historically that many different groups in America have encountered. We focus on 12 different groups, and these are interactive stations for people to work with. And then the repair process by which Americans bring their reality more closely into accord with the ideals on which we are founded. Throughout all of this, we highlight upstanders by putting them in what we call upstander red. So on panels, you will see that same red color that you saw when you walked in and saw that initial definition of an upstander highlighted in the histories that we cover. We even have a Texas upstander wall in this particular section. And we end with a call to action. And the call to action is an interactive section where people can type in their names and their email address, and they can explore local, national, and international organizations that will enable them to volunteer and interact. In other words, to put their money where their mouth is. This is just how we do this in terms of the actual physical visit. And there's many more programs that we do. I want to step back just for a moment to the 10 Stages of Genocide Gallery and say that because we're using it as an educational and an awareness tool, what we did is we created, in building the museum, 10 different graphic novels, each of which follows a composite young person or young people so these are based on actual historical figures through their experiences in this genocide, but illustrating the particular stage that genocide is being used to illustrate. We make it very clear to all the students who use these novels, and I've recently found out that they're being used in college courses as well, which is very exciting. The front page of each graphic novel gives you the stage, so classification, symbolization, preparation, extermination, denial, whichever stage it is, and that particular country and genocide. The back cover of each graphic novel gives you that same stage and how it developed in the Holocaust. So you can use these to teach the Holocaust as a genocide, or you can use these to teach particular moments in genocide through particular historical genocides, because, as we said, our DNA was Jewish, and the Holocaust becomes our paradigm of genocide. So we wanted to keep that in mind as kind of the connecting theme as you go through. That's really all I wanted to share with you. I'm happy later on to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I found that very interesting as a peace educator, thinking about the way that you're presenting genocide. I wanted to address the theme today that's in the brochure: repairers of the breach, religion making a difference. And so I want to start with my own position on this, which is that religion and religious institutions are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. They can be either of those things. And through looking at the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, explore an example of where Christianity or Christian churches were very complicit in the genocide. A question to consider for a moment: what were you doing in the summer of 1994? I was 10 years old. I remember it well. It was a scorching hot summer in England, which is unusual. And I remember playing a lot of football. That's soccer to most of you, and water games. This is a young man called David. And David is Tutsi. And in the summer of 1994, David was tortured to death in the genocide. He was a boy who loved to make people laugh. He wanted to become a doctor. He was the same age as me. And he was killed not for anything he'd ever done, but purely because of who he was. I give this just to kind of make us consider a moment what genocide is and the idea of being targeted because of an aspect of our identity. He's not alone. This is Bernardine, a 17-year-old who loved to play football as well. This is Fabrice, an 8-year-old in Rwanda. But it doesn't stop there. More recently, these are children survivors of the of Daesh's genocide against the Yazidi. This is a mother holding a photo of her son, who was murdered alongside 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica. This is a young man called Stephen Lawrence. He's in the UK. He was murdered because he's black. And I make this point to kind of bring it home as well, that identity-based violence, being targeted because of an aspect of your identity, isn't limited to the kind of the world's big genocides, but it's all around us. This is Mireille Knoll. She survived the Holocaust, only to be murdered in 2018 in an anti-Semitic attack in Paris. This is Shabazz Hurli, who made it from Syria to the UK, but survived a racially aggravated murder attempt. Benjamin Hamasson, killed by neo-Nazis in Norway. So it's all around us. Moving to Rwanda, though, there was a particular character in the Rwanda genocide, which is the role that churches played. They were the primary killing fields. This is the church at Nyamata. What you see on the pews is the belongings of the people who were killed there, 10,000. And they went to the church because they believed that in a house of God, they may be safe. And all over the country this happened, that people congregated in churches, and it just made it easier for the genocidaires to target them. There are 50,000 people buried in the church in Nyamata. And when after the massacre, people found laid on the altar of the church some of the weapons that were used to kill men, women, and children in that place. It wasn't by chance, though, that churches were a killing space in Rwanda. This wasn't just a coincidence. The church played a role in the genocide. And I want to just explore two ways that the church played a role. A moment ago, we heard about this idea that there are stages to genocide, and we'll look at that again in a moment. That people divide, people begin to stereotype, people begin to discriminate. That these are stages of genocide. Christian churches in Rwanda were complicit in all of these stages. But I want to look at two issues in particular. One is the role of the church, particularly the Catholic Church, in driving social, ethnic, racial, and gender inequality in the country. And secondly, the role of the church in inculcating a culture of hierarchy and obedience to authority, blind obedience to authority, where people were commanded to kill, so they killed. So I'll just briefly discuss each of these. So Rwanda was colonized by originally Germany and then Belgium. But actually the real colonizing power were the White Fathers of the Catholic Church. And their principal aim was to convert people to Christianity, which in and of itself is not a bad objective for people who believe in Christ and people who believe in the power of Christ's message. And this is a from an archive I found in the Vatican. It's sort of 1963, dividing the country up into pagans and Catholics. So this was sort of how they were sort of seeing the country, is how successful are we being at converting people. In the early days of this movement, the White Fathers understood that the most successful route to mass conversion of the country is to get in with the leadership of the country. So they worked very closely to impress the Tutsi royal court. So Rwanda is a country of two major ethnic groups, about 10% to 15% Tutsi, the minority, and the majority were Hutu, but the minority were the more powerful. And so they worked actively to uphold the power structure that they found. And I'll share a quote with you from Major Hirth, who was one of the White Father leaders. He said this. He taught the people to render unto Caesar. So he discouraged missionaries from taking up the causes of the marginalized and directed them to focus on gaining favor with the rulers, partly based on the idea that conversion of the entire population would be more likely with the support of the ruling class. And he taught the missionaries to render unto Caesar and Musinga, the Rwandan king, all that can be returned to Caesar and Musinga. And so by empowering the elite, they supported a culture of hierarchy and inequality in the country. Now, this isn't true of all Catholic leaders. Later, there was a leader called André Péradin, who himself was from a poor background, and he was probably on the political left, and he wrote and his concern that in our Rwanda, differences and social inequalities are to a large extent related to differences of race, in the sense that wealth on the one hand and political and even judicial power on the other are to a considerable extent in the hands of the people of the same race. Now, in this kind of colonial context, though, the church had had redistributive power. The church controlled the schools. The best schools were the petits séminaires, where people were trained to be priests. Only Tutsi were being trained to be priests. And so through the power of the church to decide who gets what jobs and who gets what roles, there was inequality growing in the country up until 1959, when there was a revolution. And that revolution saw the first genocide against the Tutsi, as people were swept out. Many Tutsi fled into exile into surrounding countries. It was in 1990 that their children came back to Rwanda, invaded Rwanda, to try to reclaim it as a homeland, that precipitated the events that led to the genocide in 1994. So, in this sense, this picture, by the way, on the right is Begina. He was the first black priest, and Péradin asked specifically for him to ordain him because he wanted to make a point that he was being ordained by a black bishop, which was important to him. So there was tension, and it's important I stress that, because this is not an attack on the Catholic Church and my own positionality. I come from an Irish Catholic heritage. I'm a Christian. But it's important that we understand the role that churches and religious institutions can play. So secondly, hierarchy and obedience. There was a culture of blind obedience to authority. And that culture was strong. People were not taught to think for themselves. They were not taught to question. And those of you who maybe come from any kind of religious background, maybe consider the institutions that you come from as I say this. So a moment ago, we talked about this continuum of violence. This is where I'll finish, really, is I don't expect you to read all of this. These are the stages to genocide. Looking at things like discrimination, the way that people start to identify as belonging to one group or another group. The way that then there is actual discrimination, as in some people have access to power or opportunities that other people do not have access to. And again, we have a history. There's a history in this country, there's a history in this state of religious institutions deciding who has access to what positions. And a culture then of obedience to authority that meant that when And this is the most troubling thing in Rwanda of all, I think, that up to 1 million people participated in the killing. This wasn't just an army, this was a popular genocide in which up to 1 million people participated. So what can be done about this? Well, in reverse to the continuum of violence, these steps to genocide could be a continuum of benevolence. And I would say that faith-based organizations are possibly the best place to do this, beginning with helping people to open up, to respect each other, developing empathy, developing care and service towards others, connecting people, building community, building love. We can also apologize for past wrongs. This is a statement from the Catholic Conference of Bishops. We apologize for all the wrongs the Church committed. We apologize on behalf of all Christians for all forms of wrongs we committed. We regret the Church's members violated their oath of allegiance to God's commandments. Forgive us for the crime of hate in the country, to the extent of also hating our colleagues because of their ethnicity. We didn't show that we are one family, but instead killed each other. And this is a reality. There were priests who participated in the genocide. There were members of congregations who turned against other members because in the end, they were not one. And so I think there's something to consider is the way that faith-based organizations can build critical thinking. Do we encourage a culture of openness? Do we encourage people to ask questions, or do we tell people to, no, stay quiet, just accept what you're being told? Do we encourage critical thinking, particularly in our rising generation? Do we encourage dialogue between faiths? I've been sort of filled with joy at what I've heard so far today. Do we do these things? Because religious-based organizations are possibly the best place to also teach values and do this work. And so it's not that religion is inherently bad or good, but it can be either. And I finish on that thought that we need to consider what role we are playing in building openness and respect and love. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett, and it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. I have already learned so much from the events of this morning. I was incredibly moved and uplifted by each of the speakers in our opening plenary session. And now my two colleagues here on this panel have really deepened my understanding of a subject that I know a bit about, but really we are being well fed and I hope well challenged as we gather for this important conference. I am, like everyone else who has the opportunity to be here, honored to be joining you today. And I'm particularly grateful that I was asked to be on this panel dealing with preventing genocide, because as Paul mentioned in his kind introduction, I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivors. My late father, Tom Lantos, was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever to serve in the United States Congress. And of course, he will remain so because that generation is passing from the scene. And so this topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart and very much on my mind on a regular basis. I'd like to begin my brief remarks today not so much by talking about preventing genocide in the abstract, but by first sharing the story of two individuals who themselves determined to try and prevent genocide. The first was Raoul Wallenberg, the great Swedish humanitarian who was responsible for saving both of my parents' lives. Raoul Wallenberg was the son of one of the most powerful and distinguished and important families in Sweden. The Wallenbergs are sort of the Rockefellers of Sweden. And as a young man, he studied actually architecture here in the United States and had gone back to Sweden. And he could have easily lived out those terrible years of the Second World War in the security and peace of neutral Sweden. But he could not do that. His conscience, his sense of shared humanity did not allow him to take that easy way out, if you will. And so, because he had had some background with having worked with a Hungarian Jewish exporter through his family's bank some years earlier, he volunteered to go on a very dangerous assignment to Budapest. Hungary had been an ally of Germany throughout the war, but was, in the view of the Germans, becoming an uncertain and a teetering ally. And in fact, Hungary was looking for a way to break its alliance with Germany and go to the other side. Because of this, it was occupied by Germany in March of 1944. And that really began the true nightmare for the Jews of Hungary. Up until that time, their lives had become more and more constrained. There had been persecution, there had been exclusion. They were kicked out of schools, kicked out of jobs, their businesses were taken over. But they hadn't yet experienced the mass deportation. But beginning in March of 1944, the deportations of the Jewish community of Hungary, which I should mention had been among the most assimilated and integrated Jewish populations in all of the countries of Europe. It was kind of an interesting little footnote of history that Jews became considered as Hungarian citizens earlier in Hungary than in many other places, because during the period of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when Hungary itself included many other countries and peoples, what the Hungarian government recognized was if they counted Jews as Magyars, as Hungarians, then they would be a majority within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But if they didn't, then the Romanians and some of the other ethnic groups would actually outnumber the Magyars. And so against this backdrop of tremendous inclusion and assimilation within the country they considered their home, suddenly the Jewish people became hunted animals. And, you know, this was so personal for our family. My father was a passionately patriotic young Hungarian. He adored everything about his native land, its culture, its language, its food, its music, its intellectual and academic achievements. And he himself was a brilliant, extraordinary young man, but suddenly he was a hunted animal in his own country. So into this cauldron of nightmare and terror came Raoul Wallenberg. He had really nothing in common with those whom he came to save. He was rich, and they were, by then, poor and persecuted. He was Christian. They were Jewish. He was Swedish. They were Hungarian. What could or would compel him to leave that safety and security of Sweden to come and try and rescue these people? He recognized in those persecuted Jews of Hungary his brothers and his sisters, his fellow human beings, and this deep sense of shared brotherhood is what drove him to undertake this dangerous, dangerous mission. He ultimately was responsible for saving, it is estimated, 100,000 Jewish lives in the midst of that horror. And as I said, my mother and father were among them. And I could take all my time to talk about Wallenberg, but I want to move on to I should mention that at the end of the war, Hungary was in the Soviet zone of occupation, and the Russians were deeply suspicious of this Gentile Swede who had come to rescue the Jews of Hungary. And of course, he had become a legend in Budapest, which was the capital city, the center of power. And they feared his influence. He had great hopes for a democratic and free future for Hungary. And so he was kidnapped by the Soviets, disappeared into the Gulag, we still don't know the full fate of what happened to him, but we do know that he died in Soviet custody. The second person I would like to call out as someone who stood up to fight and to prevent genocide is Paul Russessa Begina. And you may have noticed that rather than being dressed in a normal sort of proper business attire for this speech, I chose to wear a T-shirt that says Free Russessa Begina. I did not know my colleague Sam would be talking and focusing his remarks on Rwanda. But Paul is the man whose story is told in the movie Hotel Rwanda. I see some nodding heads, and any of you who have not seen the movie, I would really encourage you to do so. He was, in his own words, an ordinary man. He was a hotel manager. He managed the Hotel Mille Collines. And when the genocide began, his hotel became a refuge for 1,200 Tutsis and moderate Hutus who fled there to escape the Interahamwe militias that were executing this unimaginable genocide. Probably the most intense genocide in history. Sam, I think you're more of a scholar of this than I am. But in a shorter period of time, the number of people massacred in this utter lawlessness, this utter nightmare of bloodshed, of the most brutal variety, you know, in a way, a great contrast to the Nazi Holocaust, which had plenty of bloody brutality. But one thing that was so terrifying about the Nazi Holocaust was that all of the tools of science and technology were brought to bear on the job of murdering millions of innocent people. In Rwanda, the tool was the machete and the hatchet and knives. Very, very contrasting, but both horrifying examples. Well, Paul, using his wits, using bribery, using every tool at his disposal, somehow was able to keep these militias that were literally encamped outside the hotel, waiting, desperately eager to go in and massacre every man, woman, and child in there. But he succeeded in keeping them at bay and saved those 1,200 lives. Just as Raoul Wallenberg was kidnapped after his heroic deeds, Paul Russessa Begina, nearly 2 years ago, was kidnapped by Paul Kagame. He sometimes is referred to as the darling dictator. He was welcomed and hailed really at the end of the genocide because he had led the forces which helped finally bring a conclusion to the genocide, but sadly in the more than 2 decades since has himself become a brutal, thuggish dictator, disappearing opponents, clergy, journalists, anybody who challenges his rule. And Paul is one of those who he has targeted as an enemy. So Paul Russessa Begina, about 2 years ago, was kidnapped, taken to Kigali against his will, subjected to a show trial, and has been sentenced to 25 years imprisonment in a trial that violated all international standards. And he is not a young man, and he is not a well man, and so it is, in effect, a death sentence. And I and many others are working around the clock to try and free this brave and good man, somebody who really was a shining light in the midst of a terrible genocide, the largest genocide in our recent memory, and that he should meet this fate. But I think, in a way, the fate of these two individuals who said, we will, in our own way, to the extent that we can, prevent genocide, kind of helps answer the question of why it is so hard to prevent genocide. It's dangerous. It's risky. You are putting an awful lot on the line if you step forward individually to try and stop the evil in its tracks. And unfortunately, for those who are not the individuals on the front line, but rather governments, there is always a weighing of costs. There are countervailing arguments. There are, sort of common sense concerns and weighing in the balance of whether or not this is worth it, that sometimes leads good people and even good governments to do little or to do nothing. Now, much of the answer to how we prevent genocide really does lie upstream of the events that I've been describing. It is about education. It's about understanding that 10-step sort of template for how genocide can be brought about. And these are critically important things: education, combating, the whole social mechanisms that lead to the kind of targeting and othering and division that can lead to genocide. But I would say that in the context of our conference today, one of the critical components is, in fact, embedding freedom of religion, conscience, and belief in the warp and woof of our societal fabrics. So many of these genocides do revolve around targeting people specifically for an identity, and very often that identity is a faith identity or a religious identity. And so I am very much, you can put me very much in the school of thought that believes that freedom of religion and conscience and belief and all that we associate with that is part of the answer to preventing genocide. And you're going to, I'm sure, I know, be hearing a lot more about that in a very positive way. But I'd like to use my last few minutes to focus on two very immediate and present challenges we are facing, one of which has already been declared a genocide, the other of which is certainly adjacent to genocide and has been called a tool of genocide. Because part of what I think the organizers of this conference want is that everybody who attends doesn't go home and say, wasn't that interesting? That you don't go home and say, oh, I learned so much. What they hope, I believe, is that you will go home and say, what should I be doing? What kind of a difference can I make? And you can, and you must. And so I want to talk about two very current, present crises. The first is very well known, and that is the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region of China. Now, this has actually already been declared or labeled as a genocide by our government. Most recently, it was done during the Trump administration, and it was reiterated during the Biden administration. And what is happening in that region, and it is entirely religiously based. I mean, this is directed against a minority Muslim population. And what is happening, of course, we know about the mass incarceration, the arbitrary arrest and detention, and mass incarceration in what the Chinese would like to refer to as education camps. But if you follow the news, you know just recently video was released that absolutely puts the lie to that outrageous claim. These are prisons. These are concentration camps. And in those camps, people are being subjected to torture, to rape, to forced sterilization, to forced abortion, and of course, in many instances, to death. It's not that we have done nothing. Our government has declared it's a genocide. The Congress has passed several important pieces of legislation, the Forced Labor Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act. But if we're honest, our response has not matched in any way the gravity of what is being faced by that community. The second example I want to share with you, which also impacts the Uyghurs, although that's a more recent development, is not as well known, but it's the horrific practice, which has been going on in China now for a long time, of forced organ harvesting. I don't know if any of you have even heard of this issue, but it is increasingly coming to the fore, and I would really encourage you to Google it later today. You'll see there have recently been articles in the Wall Street Journal, in USA Today, in various medical journals. This practice recalls the worst evils of Dr. Mengele, the notorious Nazi doctor who conducted so many experiments on Jewish prisoners in concentration camps before they were killed. And what basically the Chinese government has been doing for a long period of time is taking prisoners, they give them various tests to determine the health of their organs. Then they are sentenced to death, and their organs, they're basically killed for their organs. Now, the thing that you have to remember is that a huge number of the prisoners in China are individuals whom we would describe as prisoners of conscience. And increasingly, the evidence is coming forward that they have their organs harvested before they are dead, because that means the organs are fresher and better. And I see, I hope you're feeling ill. I see some of your faces, and honestly, I hope that this is troubling enough to you that you are feeling your own insides turn upside down as you think about a practice like this, as you think about surgeons who engage basically in the surgical murder of prisoners to harvest their organs. Now, the primary group that has been for many years the target of this evil and criminal practice has been a religious community, the Falun Gong, who practice a very peaceful form of exercise and meditation, but a group that the Chinese government has designated as an evil sect. But there is growing evidence that Uyghurs are now also being used for this heinous practice. In fact, there have been flyers, online flyers, in the Gulf states that have been found advertising halal organs for transplant from Uyghurs. In 2015, the Chinese government claimed to have stopped the practice of using prisoners for organs. They denied, of course, what they had been doing all along in terms of condemning people in order to get their organs. But they said, no, we understand that prisoners can't voluntarily give their consent, so we're going to move to, a more ethical system of organ harvesting. But the facts simply do not bear out that that has happened. And, some of this stuff you sort of have to say, we aren't stupid and we are not going to be fooled by your propaganda. So under China's voluntary system of organ donation, where people like we can here in the United States can sign up and say, if I'm in an accident, I want my organs to be available for transplantation. There are 1 million individuals in China, a country of some 1.2 or 3 billion people, who have signed up on the voluntary organ donor list. Contrast that to the United States, where we have 145 million people, which is pretty impressive, in our country of some 330 million people who have signed up on their driver's licenses to make their organs available for donation. In the United States, where we have 145 million people as part of the voluntary organ donor program, individuals have to wait, if they are fortunate, months, but often years, for the possibility that an organ that they or a loved one may need will become available. In China, and it's a huge industry for them, a multi-billion-dollar industry, people can order organs to be available within days and weeks. You don't have to be a genius to connect the dots, and you have to be an idiot not to connect the dots and not to call out what is continuing to go on. There was a very distinguished tribunal that was convened in Britain in 2019 to examine all of the evidence about this practice. And it was actually led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who had been one of the chief prosecutors in the International War Crimes Tribunal for Slobodan Milosevic, so a very distinguished individual. That tribunal concluded that this practice is absolutely still going on, that somewhere between 25 and 50,000 people are killed every year, excuse me, to harvest their organs. I'm just going to get So we are not talking about history. We are talking about now. Just a few weeks ago, there was a hearing before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the Congress where a surgeon testified who had been forced to conduct some of these organ harvesting on live prisoners. And he described it, I think, so powerfully. He said, people have a hard time believing it because it's almost too terrible to be true. It's almost too terrible to be true. But that is always true of genocide. It is too terrible to be true, and so we somehow turn away or convince ourselves it can't be happening. What can we do? Well, I think I'd like to close with an example of what we must not do. Just a few days ago, a distinguished international diplomat by the name of Michelle Bachelet, she is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, went to China first visit by a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in many years. And those of us in the human rights community had hopes that she would, in China, in front of the Chinese leaders and in front of the Chinese people, call that government out for some of these outrageous practices. Sadly, tragically, shamefully, she did just the opposite. She basically, in her public statements, parroted the absolutely false narrative of the Chinese government that, for example, speaking about the Uyghur genocide, that these were simply education and retraining camps, and that the effort of the Chinese government was aimed at de-radicalization and combating terrorism. Shame on her. Shame on her. Likewise, about Tibet, another region that has suffered greatly under the oppression of the Chinese government, she once again parroted the official line. This is really outrageous and really shocking. This is the individual in our one international body that is supposed to stand for human rights. And instead, she handed a tremendous propaganda victory to the Chinese government, which is now, of course, quoting and reproducing and republicizing all of her commentary. There was a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, from the human rights community, and I have one sort of, I guess, positive bit of news to share, which is she announced, in light of the outrage, global outrage, over her failure to do her job, that she will not seek another term as High Commissioner when her term comes to an end. But that's an example of what we don't do. We don't make excuses. We don't turn away. We don't buy dangerous, corrupt euphemisms for evil being perpetrated. I'm going to close, and I know I've been saying I'm going to close for a while. I apologize. I keep delaying it. But I'd like to share a story from my father's experiences when he was in a slave labor camp as a young teenage boy, taken from his family. And this was in Hungary. And he was in a barracks where, for some reason, the head of his barracks decided that he was going to burnish his reputation or his credentials somehow by compelling all the Jewish boys to be baptized. Now, these kids, these boys, they were starving, they were beaten, they were terrified, and they felt very alone. And so all of them, just to placate and appease this barracks commander, agreed to be baptized. All except two, my father and his best friend. And they were beaten very badly for their refusal to comply with this demand. But they would not. And from what I know of my father at that time in his life, he was not a particularly religious young man. He had a sort of general belief in God, which later, as his life went on, would give way to a much more skeptical agnosticism. But I don't think for him that it was so much that the specific tenets of his faith were so central to him at that time, but it was rather something deep in the soul of that young man that understood that if he allowed his own conscience, his own right to freely choose for himself who he was and what he would believe, to, in the words of Scripture, to possess his own soul, that he would lose something of infinite value and importance. And he was ready to pay a heavy price not to lose that. And I like to think that it was maybe at that moment in his life that the qualities he later developed that made him such a powerful defender of the rights of others was awakened. I think of the slide we saw in the plenary session that compelled worship stinketh in the nostrils of God. I think my father understood that somehow. So So being people of conscience, and many of us here are people of deep religious faith as well, and so our conscience compels us to live out our faith. Our conscience compels and demands that we live in accordance with the precepts that we profess and that we believe. It really is central to building decent societies. It is central to preventing genocide. It is central to possessing our own souls and having the integrity of character, that whatever the outcome, whatever the final result of our act of conscience, our act of courage, our act of defense of others is, we will be all right because we have chosen that more noble path. You know, there's a wonderful saying in the Talmud that says, "He who saves a single life, it is as if he had saved the world entire." And I thought of that almost 11 years ago when my first granddaughter was born, because she happened to have been born on August 4th. August 4th is the birthday of Raoul Wallenberg. Now that beautiful, feisty, delightful little girl would never have had the opportunity to be born had not Raoul Wallenberg saved her great-grandpa and her great-grandma. And that great-grandpa and great-grandma had 2 daughters. And that one of those daughters had her mother, and her mother had her. And that phrase just gave me a chill when I realized that my first granddaughter shared Raoul Wallenberg's birthday, and that because that brave man put his life on the line to save a life, he really had saved a world entire. Our whole little world was saved by him. And for that, I will be forever grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If you have questions, feel free to approach the panelists. It's been a tremendous panel. I think we've been, as was noted about nurturing and nourishing, richly fed. Many different thoughts and directions I'm sure that you all have. Now, the next panel is going to be beginning forthwith, so we need to clear the room. Let's thank the panel one more time. Thank you.